everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to our Twitch stream this evening, in which we shall chat about urban settings. There's 4 of us here tonight. Andy Law is not very well, but we are hoping that he'll be better later on in the week, and we will be back for another stream in which we talk about tips and tricks for GMing an urban setting and anything that we don't get to tonight. So look out for that. And hi to everyone watching live on Twitch, and hello to everyone watching on YouTube afterwards. So please do put your comments and questions in the chat on Discord too. It'll pop up on my phone hopefully, or my watch, and I'll be able to read the questions there, and I will pop them on the screen as they come up. So hello to Mark, to Graham, to Andy Leask. Shall we get started?
Oh, you're getting very, very slick at these intros, Lindsay, I must say.
Thank you very much.
I feel we need to shout out Seagull for being first again in the comments every week.
Here we go. First.
Well done.
Always. I rehearsed that on the train because I had to make it wasn't unexpected, a little trip out with the bounds of Edinburgh for the first time in many months, which was exciting. So today we're talking about urban settings. So my first question for the Rooks, do you prefer fictional or real world settings? And maybe before we get to that, I'm going to give you time to mull over it. What is the attraction in general of creating an urban setting? I'm going to go straight to Graham, the master of the city setting.
Oh, well, that is a huge question. As fictional versus real world settings, as a lot of people know, I am a big history geek. I describe myself as a recovering archaeologist, and so I've written a few source books on fictional settings. As far as cities go, I think I prefer fictional cities, or fictionalized cities, let's put it that way. So if I were to do a setting based in Rome, for example, let's say medieval Rome, it would have more in common with Assassin's Creed than with actual history. The nice thing is to just plunder the good bits and then build them out and add some more fun stuff. So yeah, for cities, definitely fictional or fictionalized settings. First cities, sorry,
I was just going to say, interesting the challenge between fictional and real world. So I was reminiscing while I was on the train about our old vampire game and how when we weren't at the end, but I knew it would end one day because Gehenna was on the distant horizon. And I said to my Andy Law, like, I just couldn't see myself getting as attached to a fictional setting. I didn't feel they were deep enough. They didn't feel real enough. You couldn't go out and, investigate it and research it yourself. And he was like, challenge accepted. And I like to think that's why he got involved in Wifrip 2nd edition. So he could create to me my own, my own personal world.
Yeah.
But actually, I was thinking, and we're saying to Andy Leask, in our Wifrip, in that fictional setting, I do think he could go to any major city in the Empire, and with a few lines of description and a bit of accents that we've layered on, Andy Leask and I would know which setting we were in immediately. So I've actually come round over the years to preferring, not necessarily preferring, but definitely liking fictional settings.
Yeah, I mean, a lot depends on how it's done.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, like, as well, like, it's the depth of material that's there, isn't it? Like, the reason we would feel that way about those cities is because we played in a campaign that went on for decades. We visited these cities multiple times. We lived in most of these cities for extended periods, in our imaginations, obviously not literally, which meant that we had that depth of material. Like the reason, like, real world cities or cities based, as Graham says, like fictionalized versions of real world cities, the reason they can feel so authentic is because you can look at the maps and you can look at the buildings and you can read the diaries of people who lived there, and there's so much research you can do. It feels much more 3D in your imagination. And I suppose if you play in a fully realized and well developed fictional world, and that's perhaps something we'll get onto later, it can then come alive to the same extent in your imagination.
Yeah,
So.
That's a really good point, though, because given the amount of work involved in creating a fictionalized setting, city or otherwise, to the same level of detail as a historical one has, is an enormous amount of work, if players aren't willing to extend it for themselves. And, Warhammer, the Empire, has been developing for 35 plus years now, with people just adding stuff. It was no way anything new from the whole cloth could be that detailed. So there is an advantage to the historical cities.
And what about you?
I mean, I found I found certainly drawing inspiration from historical cities as they've developed over the centuries is a really great start. I've been reading Catherine Arnold's books on London. Which is a series of books. It's all those sort of the grisly, macabre, perverse, accurate underbelly of how London has developed from pre-Roman times right up to the 20th century. And there's so many fantastic little nuggets, as well as it being incredibly eye-opening. The nuggets you can think, that would be great in a fantasy setting, because it seems fantastical, even though it's historically accurate.
Well, yeah.
So anywhere where those lines sort of blur is always really a rich source of inspiration.
Yeah, there's stuff in history you simply can't make up, and whether you base not, or if you do, you need help. Whether you use it in the original context and create a fictionalized version of a city with the outrageous historical bits preserved, or whether you just steal the outrageous historical bits and put them in your own setting, it's a matter of personal taste.
Some of my favorite online arguments were around about Withrop Second Edition on the Old Black Industries forum, when there was perhaps a certain breed of gamer who perhaps preferred the more kind of low fantasy, kind of grimy side of things,
right,
and felt Second Edition was pandering too much to the kind of high fantasy wargame, and they would just cite things and be like, this is a ridiculous over the top thing, and then you'd be able to go, well, here's the historical thing it was based on, and here's a picture of that thing you said could never exist that literally existed 400 years ago, and it was a great way of just shutting down that line of argument.
Yeah, and that was a large part of how Withrop First Edition, at least, wound up the way it did, was because so many of us. I mean, I have an archaeology degree, so did Rick Priestley. Everybody were war gamers and were self-taught historians, and particularly if you're a self-taught historian, the things that stick in your mind are the grisly and improbable anecdotes. And so to a large extent, Withrop, the old world, was a distillation of all of that.
And I think then it sounds like back in ancient history, before, like, the internet wasn't obviously the resource it was today. So when we were sort of starting our vampire campaign and moving towards it, there was kind of the explosion of search engines, and they went from being pretty poor to actually being pretty good. Whereas when Withrop itself, when First Edition was published, you couldn't access that kind of esoteric, unusual knowledge in the way that you can now. Likewise, a few years later, you couldn't access a wiki about Warhammer in the same way that you can now. So I think we're almost spoiled now. Like, our kids are spoiled with horrible histories, and you tell them something that happens, and they'd be like, I saw that on Horrible Histories. Yeah, that's not a big deal anymore.
Yeah.
But so I think it really has changed the way we interact with the research of our settings. Certainly from when I started role playing to now.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So what if you're talking about a city setting source book itself, what do you think are the key things that you would like in there?
Well, there's two ways. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something that Mark actually mentioned before, that the idea of an underbelly. Like, I think it's really important that there is scope for lawlessness within a city. PCs with the best will in the world are not always going to do the thing that they should legally do. They would be boring if they did. So you need to give players a place where they can go and break the law. Maybe not without any consequences, but where clandestine stuff can happen, shady stuff can happen, fights can happen, there can be violence, there can be lawlessness, there can be that kind of thing. So I think, a lot of, again, I think we've spoken before about how the terms high fantasy and low fantasy are not necessarily very helpful, because within each of those terms, there's a myriad of different things. But I think, like, my problem with a lot of fantasy settings from a long time ago, and it's got much better now. But the thing that I think when people talk about low fantasy or like gritty settings like that we're interested in, is that it isn't just a sort of a clean kind of knight in shining armor style story. It's a bit more authentic. It's a bit more nasty. It's got room for bad stuff to happen to your players and for your players to do bad stuff. So I think for me that's absolutely key. Whether it's gangs, whether it's vice, corruption, what exactly it is. Doesn't really matter. It just needs an underbelly. So
yeah, I mean, I think like cities aren't monoliths, and I so for me, I like a realistic history that maybe layers on sort of the different demographics, why the city has come to be, that it's maybe changed hands, because most cities with any sort of length of time that they've existed, they haven't been in the same faction with the same politics for all the time they've existed. So I quite like a realistic layering of factions and therefore architectures and backgrounds in a city, personally.
Yeah. That is nice, and I also like the sort of the historical fossils that get left behind, bizarre traditions that made sense 500 years ago but are now quaint and a bit silly.
Yeah, and of course you probably need, I'm not a GM, but you need different things as a GM than you do as a player, but certainly factions, main NPCs, parts of the city, and I think if you think about Vampire, that is a setting that really the city itself becomes very much part of the domains, because your characters literally have the domains, so you clearly mark out the city and it becomes almost a character in and of itself, I sometimes think.
I think
I
think when a city is working, when it's good, regardless of the medium, whether it's games, fiction or anything else, it does become a character. I first noticed this when I was reading old pulps like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. The city was overshadowed everything.
I'm certainly, one of the great things you get to do with a city setting is you get to present players with little concentrated parcels of the wider world that you're hoping to kind of engage them with. Even our contemporary metropolises, they all have a Chinatown or Little Italy, something like that. So you actually, in a fantasy setting, you get to take cultures and races from all over the world and make these great little pockets of them, and the players can sort of explore and adventure and absorb the bigger world that you're painting. So it's great for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so Seagull, I find sometimes when gaming in big towns and cities, getting the feel of a busy, crowded place can be difficult to get across to the party. How would you tackle that challenge?
I mean, I know Andy at least once has used almost like a soundscape thing, like sound effects playing, which definitely helps. When you as a party have to raise your voices to talk to the person sitting next to you, because the background is so noisy.
I think having the background react to you is a way to get a feeling of crowded, just to reinforce the fact that you're not alone on this street or in this place. So there'll be people bumping into you, there'll be people maybe reacting to things you say or do when you don't intend to be overheard, and there's a story there, I can tell.
It's more than one. It's one of Andy's great. It's a shame he's not here to he probably has a better memory of them than I do. But I certainly know multiple times where as PCs we've been plotting something, and then an NPC's just like, "What? You're going to kill them?" And we're like, "Oh no, we're in public."
I do think another thing, as a player, it helps you realize that the city is quite large, and as a GM, it helps to get across, and that is needing directions to go somewhere and the GM only giving them to you once, and if someone in the party hasn't bothered to listen to the GM very closely, or like you know, in reality you don't necessarily like carry a little notebook round in character and get to write stuff down, you know, just that it's down there and then you go along there and then you go past there, which when sometimes, I mean, we've lost our way because they're like, which way did they say to go? I can't remember which way they said to go. And that actually gives you the feeling that you're in a real place, that it's not just as simple as there's one street and you walk down it and, oh, you find the quest giver. Isn't that a surprise?
Right, yeah, and stuff can be going on around you, maybe even if you do know the way. This street is closed because of a parade or something. And
we've certainly been distracted a number of times by... you know, a market, or I don't know, the meat pies.
Love a good meat pie. Yeah. But so it's really the key, I think, to answer Seagull's question is to describe what's going on around, you know, and let the players know or impress upon them constantly that there's life going on around them that has nothing to do with them. That would carry on anyway.
That's the thing. All those little minor NPCs have to actually be people. Like they're not just. It's not just a person who exists as a vendor to sell you things. That person who's a vendor has a family and has children and hates the guy across the road and is secretly having an affair with that person over there. And not all of that will necessarily come to the forefront, but you know, having that again, that depth makes it feel a bit more authentic.
Some GMs find that intimidating, but really you can make most of that stuff up on the fly. Just write it down when you do, in case you come back and revisit that NPC.
Zoltan, as GM, I like when there's a list or random events of what could happen in the city.
That's always useful when the GM doesn't know what to do. Just
and not a generic one, like one that's quite tailored to that city, or the type of city. You know, a port city is very different to, you know, an inland trading city is very different to a market town, etc.
Absolutely, they should always be tailored to the environment because they're part of telling the story of the city and presenting it to the players. And,
I guess that leads us on to, why did the Rookery decide to start with a fantasy urban setting?
Well, in a way we didn't, though. We're kind of building towards one, but we're on our way to one. I think because we all are veterans of Wooferup, we all like the cities of the Empire and the other cities that have been visited in those adventures, but we've been frustrated about certain things that we encountered in making those, and we'd just like to do one of our own. It's really about as simple as that.
I think perhaps on a subconscious level, we called ourselves the Rookery, so we thought we should probably put one in our earlier adventures, you know.
Right, yes.
Need them in a city.
Rookery being Victorian slang for a thieves' kitchen, a wretched hive of scum and villainy.
A tenement, we might say in Scotland.
Indeed. Does that make us the scum and villainy then?
Well, I mean, I don't
think there's any question about that, is there?
I've graduated from the tenement. Urban settings are limited in terms of surface content, diversity in opponents, evolution along the character. Urban settings that try to offer alternatives end up as world-size settings. What's your advice on that?
Well, yes, they are, but also an urban setting has more adventure per square meter than just about any other kind of setting. And you'll never get so much variety in one place. So I think those are the advantages. I don't think I agree that by offering alternatives, you're ending up as a world-size setting. Urban and wilderness are very different in almost all aspects of adventuring. But I can see how maybe someone might think that way. Basically, it's just the whole melting pot thing. All human life is there. Maybe there aren't some of the more outrageous monsters, or maybe as a designer or a GM, that's a kind of interesting challenge. You know, when the very early city supplements came out, like City State of the Invincible Overlord in '77, they basically fell into two camps. One, the like City State was really mostly a collection of hundreds and hundreds of NPC stat lines, with very little diversity. And the others, the best one I can think of at the moment is the old fighting fantasy book City of Thieves, where Port Blacksand was essentially a dungeon that happened to be located in a city. It was a city-shaped dungeon, so it was much more diverse. All kinds of people and things could be found there, and you can go either way. It's a matter of personal taste. But personally, myself, I like. You can have a lot of diversity in a city, I think, and the task of finding ways to sneak some of the more outrageous monsters in is a very satisfying one as a designer. And in addition, there are a lot of monsters once you start looking at the monster books for your particular game system that really come into their own in a urban setting in a way that they really can't in a wilderness or a dungeon, you know, whether it's a vampire or a succubus, or some of them really rely upon a good sort of population.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about like a lot of the encounters with, say, the Skaven in Withrop.
Right.
Like they're the classic kind of, because like, yes, they do exist in the war game and you can have armies of them, but actually their standard MO is they exist underneath human society. They kind of gnawing at the kind of entrails underneath human society,
right.
Like actually interacting with people sometimes. So, you know, it is absolutely possible. I suppose if your game is purely based on like combat progression, I suppose, and fights, if that's what's driving you, then I suppose, yeah, you will eventually, if you fit the city, run out of different types of people to fight. But I think I suppose that's sort of the point, really, is most people playing in a city. That's not the kind of game you're not exclusively the kind of game you're going for. You need some politics and some intrigue in there. Otherwise, why are you in a city? Like that's kind of what cities are for, I think.
I mean, yeah, I'm always pushing to get more opportunities to hit things with my axe, even in the city. But yeah, without constantly breaking the law, you know, it's okay. How can we thread a little dungeon, you know, a little classic dungeon sprawler somewhere in within the city confines that feels natural and appropriate, and actually having it in an urban environment rather than, you know, out in the ruins of some ancient city actually creates an interesting dynamic that you have to sort of incorporate. Well, you know, how is this place, how haven't the authorities stormed in here and cleared it out with monsters already? You know, what's holding them back? So that sort of thing, it creates some nice sort of tensions that when you place that sort of stuff within a city. Absolutely. And it's that classic thing of putting a slight limitation on what you can do forces you to be up your game and be a bit more creative.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like I just learned a thing about Back to the Future. This may be common knowledge. Everybody may know this, but in the original script, they were meant to get the power from like going to an old atomic kind of blast site in the 50s, and that's where they were going to get the power to go back to the future. But it was quite the most expensive scene in the whole movie. So when the studio said, no, you need to cut your budget, they cut that scene and came up with the lightning and the clock tower and everything, which has ended up becoming one of the most iconic and best scenes in the film. And you know, Bob Gale is like, it's a better movie now. But because he was forced to make that change, it made him as a writer kind of up his game. And so I kind of feel like that's a bit like what we're doing.
I think, like this comment from Seagull, that many multi-part campaigns can take place in a well fleshed out city, much like the Rooks have mentioned already, and I do agree with that. So if you think of some of the cities, I think the key is maybe not to make the city. You know, if you're playing in Cyberpunk, for example, right, and you've got a mega city like Night City, it becomes quite like samey and city-like, but that is what Cyberpunk is about. It's about that challenge of those corporations having become so massive. But then if you're in something like Withrop and you've got Altdorf, it's kind of set in an ecosystem around it, and your characters can be drawn out and go back in and drawn out and go back in. And so the campaign sort of circles around the city without it having to be world-sized, but you're constantly being dragged back to this magnet that is the city you're in. Then the other thought I had is about vampire, where there's a natural push like into the city because of the wild and the danger for vampires outside the cities, which naturally corral you into there.
Yeah.
I'm looking for an urban settings. Never found one that match an organic setting that do not end with the basic tropes of a built on a dungeon, native graveyard, planar mix.
There's a lot of that about. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the obvious tease here is wait till you get a load of our city. But yeah.
Oh yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, the question there is, why did the city come into being? Why is it here? And particularly in fantasy, there's a temptation to do something big and mythic and world defining or world altering about the origin of this particular city. Now, with Woofer, because so many of us were coming at it from an angle of history and archaeology, we understood the economics of cities, why they pop up where they pop up, why some prosper and why some don't. So we were pretty content to have, Marienburg as the massive seaport, the gateway to the old world, Altdorf as a mix of trade and political power, and so on and so on and so on. And we never felt the need to invoke anything as high fantasy as that in order to explain the existence of the city. And I think there are others. I mean, one of my favorites was, two of my favorites, three of my favorites, Fear, Surprise, and a Fanatical Devotion to the Pope. No, the old D&D Lankmar book, based on the novels. And I don't think there was any sort of huge supernatural explanation for Lankmar being Lankmar. And my personal introduction to urban adventures was through the old Chaosium Thieves World set, also based on fiction. And that focused on the underbelly and sort of rippled out from there into the broader city. But I don't recall that having a particular raison d'etre, other than it's a big city and it has to be somewhere, so it's here.
Yeah, I do. So I prepared that earlier. What's your favorite city setting? But just to go back to it's almost the opposite from what I was worried about when we moved away from vampire. That I felt there wouldn't be an organic setting that would match the urban settings that we had played in, because they just seemed so rich and diverse and offered so much opportunity. So yeah, what is your favorite city setting? I've always loved Nuln. Nuln, a big favorite of mine. There was Black Powder Week that brought me back every year to have some mad parties, and and it was less detailed, I would say, than some of the other, like Middenheim and Altdorf. So as a group, as a party, I think Andy Lees, with in conjunction with Andy Law, we really made it our own, and it was a city that you had your wizard's tower, I had my little palace, it was all good.
Yeah, despite that though, I'd still take Altdorf over Nuln any day of the week. But again, a lot of that comes from like that thing you were saying in terms of familiarity. I played that character for so long, who was from Altdorf, grew up in Altdorf, was a wizard who trained in Altdorf, who kept coming back to Altdorf and living in Altdorf, and at various times his social status was very different. So there were multiple districts within the city that each felt as fleshed out as a real place. Like he knew the east end of Altdorf because that's where he'd spent his childhood. He knew the kind of the north end near the Temple of Ulrich because that's where we'd sort of stayed at first. He knew some of the kind of the imperial court and everything once we began to become a bit more famous and then more acceptable in polite company. So all of those sections felt very fleshed out and real to me. So as a city, like that was probably where I've had the most fun.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the comment about how do you, I'm looking for an urban setting that has the variety. I do think a city like that does have the variety because it's what I was talking about before, it's not a monolith. Like, it's such a different experience to be down the docks and, fight it with the fish and the hooks and Altdorf, like fighting with each other, than it is to be up at the Imperial capital and coming down the Imperial Mile and fighting with students or whatever it is you're doing, or in our case like the White Wolves and the Panthers having a bit of a go at each other. So to me, I think an urban setting offers so much variety in terms of what your characters can do. What about you, Mark? What's your favorite city setting?
I'm not sure if it qualifies as a game setting, but Ankh-Morpork was always sort of me, the sort of the definitive fantasy city. Partly, of course, because Terry Pratchett centered so many of his books in there. He it gave him the opportunity to develop it in a way that I don't think we've seen anywhere else. I mean, as Graham said, Lankhmar is a great city for the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. But Ankh-Morpork was just so richness to it that is kind of unsurpassed, it seems.
Yeah, that's one of the great missed opportunities in role-playing city supplements. I would buy the hell out of that.
So this is an opportunity for us all to guess where Seagull lives. I live in a small market town, circa 12,000 people, 6,000 pre-1970s. We have underground tunnels, check, a courthouse, 2 market yards, a defunct canal a few miles away from town, several churches and graveyards, some abandoned, an early water electricity generation station full of adventure. I mean,
there's multiple scenarios I could see myself writing right there.
If it weren't for the population, that sounds an awful lot like Nottingham. And Nottingham did inform a lot of early Woothrup as well, because it had pretty much all of those things. I'm not sure about a water electricity generation station, but had pretty much everything else.
The canal, the cave, of course, the caves, the sort of the chiseled out by hand, the caves beneath the city centre. There's your Skaven right there,
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're a bit obsessed, aren't we, Andy Lace, with Edinburgh, because it's got everything you could ever need.
Yeah,
even has like an abandoned nuclear bunker. What more could you want in a city?
And we used to, when Andy and I used to work in the Games Workshop store on the high street, they subsequently fixed it. But at the time when we worked there was literally just behind the stock shelves, there was just a piece of wood that you could just move, plywood. And it just opened out into the Undercity and all the kind of caves and passages that kind of connect underneath there. It was also full of like ancient office furniture and asbestos, so we mostly didn't go in. But it was very evocative to just be able to move it and just see it disappearing into darkness. And
and Edinburgh is a city that's built on layers, so it is very much built on its own archaeology and its own, even the tenements were like that. The low class lived at the bottom and the upper class lived at the top because it was a city of hills, very Middenheim in its own way.
Yeah, and stuff flows downhill, don't flow uphill, so you want to be on the top.
Well, it's even more with some of the ones on the Royal Mile that were like 10, 12 stories high. It was almost more basically so they would go above and below street level, and the richer you are, the closer you were to the street, because if you were too high and there was a fire, you would die. So you had to be, so there was like a sweet spot in the middle, but then like the further up you went, it became poor again, and the further down you went, it became poor.
That's interesting. I'm reminded also of Seattle, and I don't think it's the only city that has this, where there's an entire city that was basically buried by an earthquake, and they built on top of it. Correct me, anyone from Seattle, if I'm getting this wrong, but I've been down there and it's fascinating. It's like all these abandoned shop fronts and buildings.
I've done that tour as well. And you realize that modern downtown Seattle is just built on top of the old one. And all the sort of the windows at street level, you see people's feet walking past. It's still kind of down there. It's amazing.
That's right. And I'm glad Ptolus came up, because this is one of the big dilemmas when you're, as a designer, when you're putting together a city setting, is how many locations do you put in and how much detail do you go into? And, if you compare, say, Middenheim, Warhammer City, or the more recent book, with, say, Marienburg as it was in White Dwarf, there's a top-down approach and there's a bottom-up approach. And what Ptolus has tried to do is both. And that's why it's like 800 pages and expensive in proportion. But I still like the bottom-up approach for if you're taking a periodical approach. I mean, if anybody in Britain remembers the old Imagine magazines, and they did the City League there, we imitated that a lot for Marienburg. And it kind of carries on. And it's a living thing that you can kind of be involved with and develop. It's a nice community project.
And Graham, as you've mentioned, magazine there, I'd just like to give a small plug for your article in Phoenix Magazine. Can you give us a little précis of what that might be?
Just a little bit of background for those who don't know. Phoenix is a Swedish role-playing magazine that publishes material in a mixture of Swedish and English. And I've been writing for them for a while now. They also have on drive-through PDFs of just the English language content, which are smaller and cheaper. So they did, also in the same issue, they did an interview with us Rooks, the theme being urban adventures. And I wrote an article just covering a lot of what I've said here today. Just a little review of cities in fantasy role-playing games, going back as far as City State of the Invincible Overlord, which I think was the first one I ever I know of, up through Ptolus and the more recent stuff for like the Ubersreich material in the Warhammer, the Wolfrup starter set is essentially a city supplement as well as a starter set with all the Ubersreich material in there. So I just wrote a little quick review. I picked out some of my favorites like Sanctuary and Lankmar and Middenheim and so on. So if you're interested in reading what I think about city settings, you can do that there.
And just to be clear, no money exchange hands for me to create that banner to showcase. What elements does a town or city need to feel complete enough, such as government, defences, religion, etc.? Yes, all of the above. Anything else?
Yeah. You need to have a sense of how it works, basically what the wheels are and how they turn. And so definitely government. Law enforcement is going to be used early and often, I think, with your average party of adventurers. So you're going to need the different agencies, their command structure, any rivalries, territories, that sort of thing. One of my favorite sort of things to do is, say in Marienburg, someone's arrested. Oh no, but he had one foot in a boat, so it's actually under the jurisdiction of the Lord Harbour Master and not the City Watch, that sort of thing. And so definitely that. The politics can be at a pretty high level. The thing to focus on, it's very tempting to just go mad and design everything, like you're writing a PhD thesis on the city. But you need to focus on the part where the rubber hits the road, where the adventurers are, what their experience is going to be. So as you go up through the command structure of the City Watch, for the sake of argument, you can get vaguer and vaguer and vaguer. Same with the politics, at least initially, and then as as they settle in, and you get your wizard's tower and you get your palace, then you can fill out the upper echelons because that's where the player characters are operating at that time. But the mistake I made back in about 1979, and the mistake I think a lot of first-time city designers make, is to just create an enormous map and go, okay, this building here is this, has these NPCs, and you could be doing that when you're 95 and not be done. You need to just focus on the player experience.
Yeah, that's true. And that's something that, like, when we did Ubersreich, that was something that in particular I tried to do, was to think about the types of player as well. And where's that type of player going to encounter, right? They're going to need, like, there was a whole bit I hadn't even thought about. It was Andy's, suggestion in terms of like really fleshing out all the dwarf stuff. Because he's like, there's a significant chance you'll have dwarf PCs. If you have one, there's a very good chance it's going to be a Slayer because it's an iconic type of Warhammer character. Yeah. So we need to have a shrine there for to give them something. I'm like, oh yeah, that's it. And then that led to fleshing out all of the dwarven buildings, which then of course led to relationships between those different dwarven factions, and then how they related to the guilds, and then the whole thing became richer because of that. And it was all driven by what the player's going to do, what might be interesting for them to encounter. So
and I think one thing Rubersreich did brilliantly well was the adventure seeds. There was never a point where I was reading something and thought, so what? Because the so what was just right there. Oh, that's how I use this. And
there's a comment there. There's some very good Call of Cthulhu city guides. World of Darkness had some. I totally agree. Some of those World of Darkness ones were really good. They are mixing history and fantasy and are a significant part of huge settings. I suppose the benefit in something like Call of Cthulhu and World of Darkness, though, is that the GM has the whole of the real world to go and research if you don't put it in your book. Whereas when you're in that fictional fantasy world, unless it's based on a bigger oeuvre of work, it is what you have put in, and then the rest is up to you as the GM.
Exactly, and that sort of circles back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, was fictional versus historical, and those sort of real world fantasy settings are the ideal mix of both, I feel.
Yeah.
Can you give us your definition of urban settings?
I mean, I guess somewhere that's predominantly built up and settled, and is certainly at least bigger than a village. Like you say, it has got multiple streets and multiple districts perhaps within it. So it's not just like you say, it's not megalithic. It's not just a single thing. There's the poor bit over there, the dock bit over there, the rich bit over there. Yeah. Essentially, I mean, it's something that anybody would look at and say that's a town or that's a city. It's really that simple.
Got to have a Starbucks at least, at least one Starbucks.
Or at least 20, surely.
Yes, there's one opened in my shed last week.
Urban is small town as well as big city. Yeah.
It can be. Bogenhafen was definitely urban, and at least the first edition version was a pretty small town.
Yeah, and I mean that definition in and of itself varies. So I would say I live in a city in Edinburgh, but if you lived in the States, you probably wouldn't call Edinburgh particularly a city, right?
No, you definitely.
Oh no, in the US, what we would call towns are cities. I live in Costa Mesa. It's the city of Costa Mesa. This is not a city; it's a town.
Yeah,
but everywhere is a city.
Yeah, in Britain there was this tradition. I think you needed a cathedral to qualify as a city.
No, I say
in America, it's a political act. You can choose to define yourself as a city and have a vote on it.
Yeah, I guess what I was meaning was Edinburgh's got 300,000, maybe 500,000 in the metropolitan area. That's very different. Talking about an urban setting to talking about Tokyo, London, LA, so the size can be anything from I don't know, tens of thousands to literally 10 million, and you're still in a city in an urban setting.
Yeah, LA is a weird one because LA is, I think, at least 7 cities make up in LA. So
that's what
you're right. You're right.
That's what happens with when cities get big, is they absorb previous settlements, and what you get, that's part of your patchwork of diversity that we were talking about earlier. In addition to the culturally distinct areas, there are those that are historically distinct. And if you arguably Orange County is part of LA, and it's a totally.
We wish we were that. We wish we were that cool.
But living in Orange County is totally different from living in Compton.
Yeah, if you think about, I'm thinking about Hamilton because I have been a bit obsessed for quite a few years now. But in Hamilton, when they're talking about we're losing Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is quite far away from wherever they are, whereas now Brooklyn is just part of the city. There's a real difference depending on what time you're living. You're
absolutely
in the city.
Yeah.
And again,
London and Westminster used to be different cities.
Yeah.
And Southwark obviously as well.
Yeah.
There with the theatres, and it's a useful thing to bear in mind in fictional cities, because those that identity can linger long past the political distinction. So like in Edinburgh, Leith, which is basically part of Edinburgh now, any Leithers watching will be like up in arms at this point, because if you live in Leith, you live in Leith. You don't live in Edinburgh.
Right.
Whereas if you live in Edinburgh, you think of Leith as part of Edinburgh, and it's again, it's a cultural identity.
It is. Yeah.
If you can have a
Leithians will be storming Rookery Towers now.
They will.
I mean, pitchforks outside.
I live very far on the other side of town from Leith. I'm all the way up a big hill. I'll be fine.
Don't
give you too many clues.
So yeah, if you can have a chase scene across a few streets where you can pass townsfolk, skirt around carts, boxes and barrels, etc., I'd call that urban.
You surely have to smash through the boxes, right? That's
Crates of chickens. You got to have crates of chickens in that sort of chase scene.
See, this is an interesting one. I think persistence of NPCs and encountering them as they improve is made easier within an urban setting, which is interesting because if I think about my experience in the real world TM, and when I now I live in Edinburgh, and when I used to live in a small town, actually I would think that when I lived in the country, the NPCs in my life, this is getting a bit meta, were much more there and memorable than they are to encounter in a city. So it's interesting that in a game, Vagrant might think that it's easier to persist those NPCs in an urban setting. What do you think?
Yeah, I suppose it's because you're less likely to spend a lot of time in a very small village in a fantasy RPG. You know, you'll arrive in a small village, you'll kill whatever monster is plaguing it, and then you'll move on like Littlest Hobo to the next one. Next time it needs you. Whereas in a city, you're gonna be using that as a base much more and spending a lot more time.
Right, you'll get to know people. Yeah, the experience of living in a small town or a village as opposed to passing through on a mission is very different. Whereas, you're exactly right. The city can become the base, and you can get known there and established there.
Yeah, and just to shout out one of our followers on Twitter, Nicholas Taylor, who he had a comment that I thought was interesting. He said he likes playing in cities because it anchors the characters in one place and allows them to develop lasting relationships, both with each other and with the NPCs. And I thought that I read that, but that speaks exactly to what I like about city games.
And when I talked to Andy about the GM aspect of it, I think he's quite keen to talk about the anchoring of players in a city and what do you do? How do you cater for players who are lawless, who may persistently, as his roleplay groups do, leave Altdorf as outlaws. So he's got some views on how, as a GM, you can kind of overcome that and build that in and keep your players anchored, even if they do consistently break the laws of the land. So, what fictional city would you like to roleplay in that isn't yet a setting? A setting hasn't had a lot written about it.
Well, one that isn't yet a role-playing setting, it's got to be Ankh-Morpork, has to be at the top of the list. Others that haven't had a lot written about them. When I was first reading the Conan stories, when I very started my fantasy career, Shadizar the Wicked sounded very intriguing, and I'd like to know more about that. So those are my two.
What about you, Mark?
I'm trying to. What was the name? Oh, okay. This is really, really, really specific. In the, I think it was the 70s or maybe early 80s. There was a limited run of a comic book, full color, fully painted, which at the time was kind of unusual, and it was called Warriors of the Shadow Realm. And there's a city in that, and I can't remember who wrote it. It's beautifully illustrated by John Buscema. And there's a city in that called the City of Seven Dark Delights, which sounds a lot like Shadows of the Wicked, but that would make a cool city just because it was so beautifully rendered. That would be a cool one to role play through.
Oh God, I can just imagine. I'm not familiar at all with the comic, but I can just imagine a city of seven dark delights where each of the city wards is based around one of the deadly sins. You know,
it's pretty much what it was. Yeah, so that would be cool.
What do you think, Andy?
I mean, for me, I thought it was interesting. Something that I hadn't thought about when I was thinking about this question until Graham talked about the kind of fictionalizing of real world places. And I think like the Victorian London of Holmes and Watson that Conan Doyle writes about. I think that would be really interesting. Again, it's a slightly heightened, slightly stylized version of kind of real history that I think would be a lot of fun. But the main one for me is, I don't know if you know the, I'm going to pronounce his name incorrectly, but the British author China Miéville. And he's done a few books like Perdido Street Station, which is set in New Crobuzon, which is a really interesting fantasy city. Or I don't know if anyone has read his novel The City in the City. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting concept. It's set in a kind of a strange kind of alternative Eastern Europe, and there's these two cities, Basel and Old Coma, that actually occupy the same space. So it's like a twist on the idea of like Berlin having East and West, but they kind of overlap geographically, and the citizens there kind of train themselves to not see the other city, so they can only see what's in their city. And I think that it's a fascinating novel. It's a really, really interesting story, and I think that would be really interesting to role play in as well, because there's a lot of scope for that.
Definitely.
I've been I sound like a teenager, but I've been watching it. So has my teenagers. Shadow and Bone on Netflix, and I really quite like that. Like alternative. You can see where they're dragging from, and I think I haven't read the books, but they're based on a series of novels. I think that looks like quite an interesting setting to play with.
Yeah,
I liked Mark Chadbourne's Elizabethan London from the Silver Skull books, where he's got the Fae are a force aligned against the Crown alongside the Spanish, and that's a fun world. That'd be a fun world to explore. It
would, and Melly's right. Neverwhere.
Of course,
Of course.
Absolutely. And also, actually, I don't know if anyone's read the Rivers of London series by Ben Aronovich. I always put Mrs. Illo out there, but they're excellent as well. And again, they're another example of that kind of contemporary urban fantasy where it's London, but then there's this magical underworld that's really, really interesting.
Definitely,
Super Shiny Purple. We're harking back to a long way with so as a newcomer to Liverpool, I just assumed it was one big place, but the more I get to know it, there are bits where locals still call their area the village. So I met Super Shiny Purple live role playing in Edinburgh through the streets of the underworld many years ago. So lovely to see Super Shiny Purple here. But I totally get that. Like you see that all over.
We've got two in Edinburgh. We've got Dean Village and Collington Village as well.
And Duddingston Village and Stockbridge would call itself a village. And
of course Stockbridge calls itself a village.
I think you'll find that Stockbridge was reported as the best village in the UK to live in.
Yeah, reported by Stockbridge.
I live in Blackpool.
You're really picking fights with the local. I'd watch yourself next time you venture out in an urban setting.
I'm praying for another lockdown to keep me alive.
You've actually, Andy, here you've actually touched upon one of the great things about an urban setting is alongside all this diversity and these different areas, you can have this rivalry, these put downs, these tensions, and that just adds to the depth and the dimensionality of the setting immeasurably.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and urban settings are not only about the location, they come with a fixed place and inertia, a mass attracting surrounding. Exactly. Interesting. I do think they do pull you back in, and I think that's why if you've got that challenge, JMT, with like, how do you keep it interesting? Well, you let your players go and then you pull them back, and then you let them go and pull them back, and you can actually explore round about the outside of the city, maybe. Now, someone is saying Necromunda would be nice to play an RPG in. And then Millie, the GM, has said that's going to be an RPG. I'm not sure if it's... Is it Necromunda?
I thought that might have been Rivers of London that I was talking about.
Okay.
Because that popped up as I was saying that, but possibly not. Millie can perhaps let us know. If it is Rivers of London, I am very excited. It is Rivers of London. I am very excited.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
that'll be one. I'm absolutely checking that out.
Yeah, Necromunda. I mean, there was always going to be a 40k RPG, and then finally there was. But there's always been this tension between the iconic sort of space marine, high-powered ass kicking of 40k, And the greater narrative potential, the greater role-playing potential lies elsewhere. It lies in the hive worlds and places like that. And I don't know how well the what was it called, Fantasy Flight 40k role-playing game did. But I know they started out with I think you were Adeptus Arbites, basically policemen in a hive wood. It was more or less I probably shouldn't say this, but Rick Priestley told me once that the Adeptus Arbites were basically the judges and the hive worlds were Mega City 1. And
I don't think there's any mystery. But I remember when the first 40k MMO video game was started development. And I was grumbling to somebody, I think it was Andy Chambers, about the fact that they'd taken sort of the archetypal playing pieces from the tabletop game and gone, oh yeah, you can be a Space Marine, you can be an Orc Warrior, you can be an Eldar, whatever it was. And I thought, oh, why didn't they just dial it down and make it set it in a hive and you know, just zoom in on one small element rather than just trying to shoehorn the big archetypes from the mass combat game.
You know, as Desmond Vang is saying here, Dark Heresy, you were low-powered members of the Inquisition. It's great for role-playing, but unfortunately, it's going to get left behind by a lot of 40k players who just want to play Space Marines.
Yeah.
And,
well,
I think. I was going to say we played a bit of Dark Heresy, and like one of the problems with it is exactly that thing to go full circle back to what we talked about at the beginning. 40k as a universe is very well fleshed out. The day-to-day life of people in the Imperium is not. And it's much more so now. There's been a lot of fiction doing that, and obviously Dan Abnett stuff, for instance, is like really, really good, and you know lets you know actually what life as an Imperial Guardsman is like, rather than just being the cannon fodder that runs out and kind of dies. But playing in that, I was very conscious because we literally went from playing Wither Second Edition into playing Dark Heresy, and you could feel how thin everything felt because it just hadn't been as developed in that day-to-day life. Sure, if we wanted to go talk about, you know, Space Marines and Tyrannid Hive Fleets and things like that, we knew all about that. Yeah. But where we bought our food from, what our food was like, you know, there was nothing.
Yeah. And, I played sorry, Graham, I was just going to say we played sort of an interesting campaign afterwards that was set on a modified Thunderhawk gunship, so that was very much the like very miniature, like a ship setting in space, and that was really interesting. It was really cool. As it turns out, the bit that I played, I mentioned it before, it was set on like based on Mass Effect, and so it was very much like being on the Normandy, and all the crew were characters, and so that in and of itself, like a very microcosm of an urban setting, a fascinating.
That's an interesting thought. A starship. I mean, that's basically Star Trek is an urban setting, isn't it? In the original series, Yeah,
and even more so in Next Generation, I suppose, because you've got actual
Deep Space
schools
Nine.
and
So I always like the freedom of low power 40k, as there are thousands of worlds, but you could design after your liking. No Hive is like, and it was really interesting to be on that on that ship and go from place to place like you would on the Normandy, go place to place and drop into these worlds and see how different they were and see how Andy had detailed them, and then like move on to the next one. It was a really it was like uber urban, because you were just dropping in the various different urban one after the other, and space stations and all sorts.
I think when Andy's better, there's a great conversation to be had about how he went about that, because designing an urban setting, when you first go to design an urban setting, it looks like an incredible amount of work. And I think there's as I say, an interesting conversation to be had about the tips and tricks for actually managing that work and, you know, making something appear bigger than the actual amount of work you put into it.
Where were the crates of chickens in Star Trek?
In the Jeffries tubes.
The crates of chickens were in Firefly.
Right.
Yeah, the old alternative Star Drive setting based you on a space station, the Lighthouse. I like that name. Moving around the deep reach of space. Yeah, our gunship jumped about a lot. The chickens got called Tribbles instead. On that note, the Tribbles note, we have reached the end of our hour that passed by quite quickly for me today, I think. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for your questions. As always, follow them up on Discord, join us there, and look out for me and Andy and anyone else who wants to later in the week. And we will be back again as a group next Saturday. Speak to you all soon.
Okay.
All right.
Toodaloo.
Bye now.
Everybody.
Bye.